hope that you guys will stay on the line. We're going to actually be moving into our next panel, which is about advancing strategies for resilience. So we've talked, as usual, as much as I hate spending time on, negative conversations, and, coffee's in my ear right now. She's like, can't we be a little more positive? Isn't there something we can do, Michelle, to make this better for everybody? And I say the answer is yes. Yes, Coffee. There is something that we can do to make this better for everybody. And so with that, we have actually two new speakers that are going to be joining us on the line. We have Dr. Marla Parker from Cal State LA, who's done tremendous work in advancing entrepreneurship for women of color on the campus at Cal State LA and beyond. We also have Dr. Ann Price, who is a founder or an executive director of Emerald Cities, and she'll be joining us as well to talk about economic resiliency. So with that, I'm actually looking, I don't know if those folks have joined us on just yet.
Dr. Parker is with us?
I'm here.
Awesome. All right. Hello, Dr. Parker. How are you today?
I'm good. How's everyone doing?
Excellent, excellent.
Good.
We've had some pretty fabulous presentations and conversations to date. Now we're ready to really get into the area of solutions. We know what the problems are, and we really want to start talking more about how are we working to advance some changes. And I know that you have done a tremendous amount of work in the area of innovation and supporting women of color and entrepreneurship. And so we'd love to hear a little bit from you today about your thoughts in advancing those strategies.
Yes, absolutely. Should I go first now or?
Yes, please.
Okay, cool. Okay, great. So I'm sorry. I'm coming off of like 2 meetings back to back, so I'm just kind of getting my sea legs going, but I am ready to talk. So my name is Marla Parker. I'm an assistant professor at CSU LA. And I'm also co-founder of the Civic and Social Innovation Group. And so what basically we're about is it's a loose, informal group of faculty, staff, and students who promote entrepreneurship and innovation as a way forward for positive social change. And so our whole thing was, how can we get students, especially in the social science area, to use entrepreneurship and innovation in a more intentional way? Because typically, like when you think entrepreneurship, you think, okay, this is money making, this should be in the B school, or, it has to do with economics. But we really believe, right, that there's more to profit, right, than just money, right? There is a such thing as like social profit, right? And so what we want to do is that what we have been doing since 2017 is taking that kind of impetus and that value set and, saying, all right, what can we do here? And so I've been working with my colleague, Dimitri Seals, who's a lecturer in sociology, for like, how do we do this and what should we do? So I do have a few slides. Would you mind if I share those, Michelle and Veronica?
Yes,
okay, cool.
You should be already the co-host, so you should be able to do that.
Okay, awesome. Hopefully, yeah. Okay, can y'all see this? It says nurturing ideation and entrepreneurial self-efficacy. Okay, cool. So basically, what we started with in 2017 was just, how do we get students excited about innovation and entrepreneurship, especially in kind of these non-traditional ways, right? Because we were teachers, and we still are teachers in political science and sociology classes. And so that's not necessarily a natural thing that you think about bringing political science, sociology, and entrepreneurship and innovation all together. And so for us, our biggest challenge was actually getting students to believe that they could do this, getting students to believe that they could be entrepreneurial and innovative in this space, right? And so a lot of what our initial work was focusing on getting them to really open up with their creativity, but then also getting them to understand that you have wonderful ideas, right? And you have so much to offer, and you have so much just creativity, you have so much knowledge. And so let's not be afraid, right, to take these steps and to learn something new. Because one of the things that we found when we initially started was that students didn't see themselves as entrepreneurs. They didn't necessarily see themselves as innovators. And again, they couldn't quite make this connection between making positive social change and these entrepreneurial, innovative principles. And so we just took a risk, right? Demetria and I said, look, we are going to start where we're at. We're going to start in the classroom because this is where we have our, locus of control, right? And so for us, being a lecturer, me being, tenured track faculty, not even having tenure, like us taking that risk was a pretty big deal. So what we did is that we infused these principles into the classroom so that students were getting them basically for an entire full semester. So I restructured my courses so that I eliminated exams. I'm like, you're not going to do exams anymore in my class. You're going to basically just focus on problem solving based education, right? And so like I created this assignment where they had to kind of be, little startups, right? Little startups. And they had to use these principles to address an issue that they wanted to address. So I didn't even force an idea on them. They had to collectively decide upon an issue to address, right? And so their solutions range from everything from starting a nonprofit to, like creating a certain kind of technology, right? Creating a certain kind of a service, creating an app, things like that. And so that was kind of like our first step in doing all of this. And so like I have here these lessons learned that, hopefully will be of interest to you. And so like when you're doing this kind of work, when you're trying to like really motivate change and you're trying to really and it's not even it's not just inspiring, right? It's again, creating that entrepreneurial self-efficacy, because self-efficacy is super, super important. It is absolutely critical for the success and the resiliency and just the, in the grit that's necessary, right, to get into this space. And so, like one of the things, here are a few things that I've learned, right? So lessons learned and recommendations for how do I inspire and how do I facilitate and nurture self-efficacy among BIPOC students, right? So one thing, right, identify how you can create change that's in an area of your locus of control. So for Demetria and I, that was our classroom. That's where we had the most control over, right? We didn't necessarily start, like at the university level with programming. We started in the classroom and then we branched out. Number two, don't do the work by yourself. I could not get far at all if I did not have Demetria as a co-founder. So don't shoulder this alone, okay? Be willing to take risks, right? But also build a network of support and allies. That is absolutely critical. And I say this kind of in the same sentence because you will need people who can help kind of buffer you, right, as you're doing the risk taking, okay? And one of the ways I can help you with that is to be a gracious collaborator in several spaces. So what I had to do is like, when there was something that was going on, I would offer my help. And that was my way of creating social capital, right? And again, creating these networks and alliances as well. Build your network outside your institution. So one of the key things that we've done at Civic is that we've grown from just kind of focusing internally to now we are partnering with organizations, right, like CHC and a whole bunch of other places, and even me and Dimitri's individual, people who we know in our individual network, and we're bringing these resources into the campus environment. So that people, not only can students experience this and to see, right, like really cool examples of social entrepreneurship and innovation, but also so that people who are in decision-making seats can say, oh, okay, like they're really doing something here, right? Like they know they're bringing resources onto campus. This is a really good thing. The next point is redefine or expand your concept of success. So when I first started, I was like, I'm the kind of person where it's like, I can have a vision and I want the vision to happen yesterday, right? But that's not necessarily practical, okay? So I wanted students to be able to create their ventures, right, immediately. But the more I got into this, I understood we have to kind of start with basics first, where they can actually get to a point they can believe that they can do this, right? And that they are really in a state of an innovative, creative mindset, right? And so like we had to reimagine our success. So rather than immediately success being, okay, they're going to start a venture, success was, you know what, they feel better and they feel more confident about taking this pathway. Now we're at a point like 3 years later where we are, you know, putting back on the table that measure of success of, okay, now we need to start having students actually create something. Now so that measure of success now is back on the table. So the next point, implement strategically so that you can be consistently successful at what you have control over, and invite key decision makers to see what you're doing. So that's why it's important to start with your locus of control, because you have control over it, right? And so if you can be consistently successful in that realm, and you can show decision makers how, like what you're doing, but also how that aligns with things like strategic planning, then that's good. So as Demetria and I were doing this work in the classroom, we would have, you know, like the dean and an associate dean and other people, you know, and the provost, right, come to the classroom and say, hey, look at what we're doing. This is how this matches with this whole entire strategic plan and the overall mission of the university, right? Because sometimes when you get into these big organizations, it can be hard for people to see how does what is happening, you know, like in the classroom on the day-to-day level match with like these more grandiose ideas, right, of strategy and planning. I have here go slow to eventually go fast. So that kind of gets to my point above when it talks about like redefining success. So again, we had to kind of slow down and like really focus on, you know, building, I would say, a group of alliances, number one, right, over time. And then also really building a really strong body of students, right? So now at this point, 3 years later, we've had like hundreds of students like go through some kind of form of programming with us, right? So that has then allowed us to build out our programming because we've been able to pick students who are now interns, and that can kind of help us to increase our capacity and increase our scale, right? The last thing is like be ready to pivot. And so, you know, being ready to pivot might mean, all right, we may need to maybe take out one dimension of what we're doing if we're not finding that it has success. Because one thing that can be difficult is like, again, like when you have a vision or a way that you think something should go, you can hold on to it, right? But you have to be able to read the room and understand and recognize like, okay, maybe my vision is not quite aligning or what's ready for what's in front of me. And so you may have to use a different strategy, and that's okay, right? So now what I have here are considerations for, oh, actually, before I dive into that, any questions at all, thoughts, feedback? I've talked a lot.
I think you're doing great, Marla. I think if you just continue on, we'll have a conversation once you're done with your presentation.
Sure. Okay, great. Awesome. Thank you. All right. So now what about, you know, the context of maybe you're not in a university setting, right? And that's okay. So there are ways for possibly implementing something similar even outside of the university setting, right? So number one, all right, start small with a program or even an activity with leaders and students or, you know, young people that you trust and who you know will participate consistently, right? And you can make it short term. Because like sometimes when we want to make these big, massive changes, we automatically go to the change the world realm, right? As opposed to just starting small, right? Small matters. And that was something that I had to really learn and pivot my mindset towards, is that, you know what, even if only one student was transformed by this was successful, right? So start small. Okay. I would say the second thing, especially in this time, this day and age, use technology to scale production and delivery of your content. And so, you know, one of the things that we are always kind of pressed for is time. So when you're creating, you know, like these programs or activities, right, like leverage the use of like things like pre-recorded content, because that allows people to go at their own pace as well, right? And it respects people's time boundaries and maybe space and capacity boundaries, right? Because you want to create as fewer barriers to entry for whatever program or idea that you have, right? I would say another thing is integrate with existing academic workforce preparation. And so like Michelle and I were talking about this the other day. And so advocating for education reform, right? So it's not just what happens in the classroom, or it's not just what happens in an individual's program, but now you're getting to like systematic things where it's not where it's, Michelle, you can talk about this. It's like the master plan for California, right? She brought up an excellent point the other day where we have to change that. We have to reform that so that it can really serve people better, right? Where the requirements in the education plan are more up to date, they're more just, they're more equitable, right? Create partnerships that can support short-term and long-term rewards or incentives for various stakeholders. So for instance, you could create a partnership where if a student, is involved in your kind of ideation program, right? Or your innovation program, okay, that means that they can get the scholarship somewhere, right? So if you can kind of create that kind of incentive structure for them to kind of stay in it, right? That would be a good thing. And then, from the university's perspective, this can be used as like a recruitment tool for them as well, okay? The last point, use and support or train the trainer model, where successful students or people, right, who come through your program, they can then take the lead and implement. Because again, you can't do this kind of work by yourself and you want to scale it, right? And so I noticed like with students, I can only go so far with students, right? I mean, like I am 40, so I am like the old fuddy-duddy at this point, right? There are things that I just don't know, right, about the generation, right? There are ways in which I can't reach, students that other students can reach other students. And so like you want to really leverage that as much as possible. And this can help you with a scaling as well. Because the other thing too is that sometimes when people see others doing what they want to do, if there's no similarity based on a similarity, they can still think it's impossible, right? So it's like, I remember, I was going over an assignment with my student, and I showed her how to rewrite something that she wrote for an assignment. And I took her language and I transformed it into something that was more like academic-y. Okay, that's not a word, but still academic-y, okay? And she was like, oh, like, I really want to write like that. I really wish I could write like that. And I'm like, you shall, and you will, right? And this is how, okay? But so it's always this balance, okay, of being a role model, but also understanding that there can be some that can only go so far depending on who the role model is, right? So when students see other students who are kind of closer in their experience range, achieve, right, and transform, leverage that, right, so that you can reach more people. So those are my points. And thank you so much for listening. Looking forward to questions.
Yeah, I think thank you so much, Dr. Parker. I know one of the things that we talked about in one of our many conversations was about access to capital, right? So, when we're talking about entrepreneurship and convincing people of, their ability to actually, be an entrepreneur. I think one of the things you mentioned was not just about the access to capital, right? And how overwhelming that can seem, right? Because it's like, well, it takes money. Where am I going to find money, to start my own business? And we all know that the statistics show it's, typically white men are definitely getting the majority of available capital as it relates to entrepreneurship. I think you also mentioned breaking down the word entrepreneur and getting them
I did.
in a their strategy and helping folks to sort of get over the idea that this is an area that they just could never do, right? That, they're gonna, like, oh my gosh, entrepreneur, that's such a big word. It's such a big thing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. So what I do with my students is that, before we really start diving into a lot of things, I do a word study, an etymology on the word entrepreneur. So if you do that, what you will find is that in the original wording, there's nothing in there that talks about money. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Okay. And when they see that, right, that the wording is really about like taking on a project, right, managing a project or managing some kind of initiative, right, then it's like, oh, okay, so like now I'm not hindered by this kind of mental trap where I have to focus on just making money, right? And when I also do a word study on the word civic and also innovation. And when you do a word study on the word civic, it comes from this Latin term, right? And I forgot, I think it's called civica. Now in the Greek or Roman days, right, civica was actually a crown, okay, that a citizen was given for saving someone else's life. So now when we talk about civic entrepreneur, then when we put those two words together, okay, we're talking about an initiative, we're talking about a project that can save someone's life, that creates community.
Amazing, amazing.
Yeah.
Big difference in what I think people interpret as
Right.
entrepreneur today.
Right. Exactly. And the other thing too is that, you know, we live in times where people can lose money as much as they make it. Right. And so if you are not kind of rooted in these other kinds of principles, right, such as what does it mean to be a good leader, right? What does it mean to, you know, like manage projects? Like, what does it mean to multitask? What does it mean to communicate? You can lose your money as fast as you make it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so like these are other skill sets that entrepreneurs must have, right? It's not just about whatever fancy idea you have, right? It's also about just like how you move and how you navigate. It's how you build relationships with people, right? Because your venture is going to fail if nobody wants to work with you.
Absolutely. And so I think that's why the collaboration that you mentioned and the strategic partnerships are so important. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes this, I think, this 2-day summit such an exciting opportunity as we continue to build our partnerships at community health councils and our Social Change Institute to advance more strategies for success and for resilience. As we mentioned earlier, you know, community health councils is steeped in its history of really advancing health access, health equity, as well as looking at the built environment of communities and food access and food equity. And in the last several years, in following in Lark's footsteps and in her legacy, Veronica has expanded that platform to really include this whole conversation idea around community ownership and economic development and entrepreneurialism. And I just love that, Dr. Parker, the idea of civic entrepreneurism. I think that's, you know, we're going to start using that one, right? You know, like be a business owner, save a life.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
You know, right? That's what we're talking about. That's what we're talking about. And so with that, I really want to pivot now over to Ann Price, who has just joined us. I want to make a note that Sonia Passy was actually going to be on this panel, and we hope that she's feeling better. She woke up not feeling so great. She has a tremendous body of work that she's been sharing around, you know, the impact of wealth stripping and on survivors and what it means to be a survivor and to deal with all of the issues that we're talking about. So we'll definitely have to have her back at a later time. Ann Price joined us actually in April and gave a phenomenal presentation around the impacts of racism on women and women of color and just on communities of color. And a lot of the statistics that we've been talking about and looking at today are some that she's been working with and pioneering around for quite some time. So with that, Ann, please, we are welcome and appreciate you joining us on such short notice. But you know, with one advantage we have in this COVID era pandemic is I just love the fact that all of you guys are sitting here with me and coffee so easily today. We love having this much company. So you know, that's the one advantage we have, right? So Ann, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me jump right into this conversation, and I hope I can do it some justice. And I'll start off, and if I'm veering off course, please please feel free to correct me. I think, you know, in the work that I'm doing and focusing on, I've really been interested in the intersection of gender and wealth and race. At the very core, they really define so much about our society. And, you know, I love the work that's being done, and a term that's coined by Janelle Jones at the Groundwork Collaborative called Black Women's Best. And it's an economic principle that basically says that if you can actually center Black women who've been certainly exploited in their labor, have diminished power, are underpaid, then you can actually see that our economy could actually do better, because you're also centering other marginalized identities. Basically, if Black women are doing well, then everyone is doing well. And we've never really been able to really think about this for a number of reasons. Now, the first thing I get when I talk about this is people say, well, what about other communities? And I think that at the core of this, and to remember kind of what drives economic inequality, what drives low wealth, really is anti-Blackness. And anti-Blackness, which is the dehumanization and devaluation of Black people, is not just about identity per se, but it really is about power. And, the fact that anti-Blackness is something that actually drives our economy, and it affects everyone who's ensnared in it, means that this is something broader than just being about Black people. But there's nothing wrong about it being about Black people. And I just want to say that, because I think that's really important. But the crux of this really is that when I've been able to really look at how women are positioned in the labor market, and really looking at how segregated that labor market is, which is not surprising to any of us, it's just so deep-seated that it actually impacts the ability for women to build wealth. People who are primary caretakers, breadwinners, who really this economy was built off of, that we are actually been ignoring to a great extent. And so this kind of economic principle allows us to say that that anti-Blackness at its core is something that actually can perhaps build greater solidarity, because it can show how we're all affected by it, and that it is a driving force in what we're seeing today in thinking about wealth. And so I'm just going to lay that out as something to throw and put on the table, because the solutions that we have going forward in this post-COVID are going to be so critical that we actually get it right. And, in doing this work for a decade, often the solutions are not exactly right, because they actually leave out so much of what affects people in their lived experience, and what affects women very specifically. So I'll stop there.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Anne. Can you talk a little bit more about the alternate solutions you're speaking to, and if not that, then what?
Look, I want to be clear that, when we think about solutions to wealth, oftentimes I'm often asked about solutions. I'm sometimes often asked about a solution, or almost like a silver bullet. And the reality is that just does not exist. I think that, right now we're certainly seeing how job loss is going to drive wealth loss. And if we think about, like Black-owned businesses, where 20% of folks hold jobs there. It's not just about. It's about the business owner. It's about the employees. That is about a job loss. And so, how will job loss actually start triggering other things, right? People pulling out savings, pulling out 401ks. People are actually either delaying or taking their savings to support other family members. How is this all being played out is something that we're still seeing in real time. And so I'm really concerned that the solutions that we're coming up with now may be too premature without greater thinking, right? That this is showing us the intersections of so many systems and structures right now that one alone is not going to do it, right? So how do we really think about this in really a true intersectional way? I mean, the first thing we got to do is figure out, how are people going to get seed capital? You know, how are people who have lost businesses, how are people who, you know, are concerned about themselves or others in terms of income and work, going to have capital to actually begin to either rebuild or to hold on to what they have? And I think that's a really challenging question for us to ask right now. Where's that capital going to come from? And maybe folks in the participants or the panelists have that answer better than I do.
You bring up a really great point, and I think that's a question I'm going to pose to Dr. Parker, as well as Veronica Flores, our CEO, at this point, to broaden the conversation. And that question is going to be around, you know, as we look at some of the ways that seed capital could be created just on a basic level, because as many of us know, and thank you, Dr. Parker, for laying out the idea that entrepreneurism isn't just about having access to a ton of capital, right? Sometimes, you know, a few $100s, you can start a business, you know, and I think we had a young woman talking yesterday about trying to convince her mom, like, hey, you're a great cook and you could make, you know, you can make more of that and you can sell it. And her mother being very intimidated by that idea and thinking, oh, no, I could never do that. We also just had our preliminary findings from our Price of Motherhood study that showed that on an average, most mothers, Black and brown mothers in South LA, are short an average of $443 a month to make ends meet, right? So now we're also in an era where we've been hearing a lot about universal basic income. We know we have pilots in Northern California and here in Long Beach. We've got organizations like the Family Independence Initiative that we hosted several weeks ago, who do unconditional cash transfers. Much of those dollars are coming from foundations, a few from municipalities, counties, and cities who've agreed to do that. And now we find ourselves at community health councils advocating with some of our funders around, you know, do we want to give out food boxes, or do we want to give people money so they can go pick out their own food? You know, like, how can we instill more dignity, less paternalism, and get money, you know, into the hands of you know, women of color in particular, so that they can start their businesses, take care of their families, and not worry about having to put themselves into compromising positions, which often they do, as we see, reaching out to ex-partners and others just for a few dollars so that they can take care of their bills. So I'm going to expand that, and I'm actually going to turn to Veronica first to answer that question.
Thank you, Michelle. And great to see you, and thank you, Marla, both of you, fantastic presentations. I mean, you guys are like, wow. So, I mean, I think there are a couple of things. There's a lot at the table right now, and I completely agree. So a few years back, quite a few years back, actually, I was working on a project, and we were trying to figure out what are some of the alternatives for forming the circles of support around women. And we started to look at, and I actually met with the governor of Okinawa in Japan, because they formed, you know, it was their 100-year-old tradition to form the circles of at least 5 people that they would come together from birth, right? They were allocated, and so there were 5 women or 5 men, you know, so it was separated by gender, so they would build those relationships, and they were encouraged to meet, so that they meet regularly. And the whole point was that they looked at their lives as, we don't live single issue lives. We started the conversation today about that. We started some of that yesterday. We don't live single issue lives. And so the whole idea was coming to bringing these groups together that the community would support. So the community would then make sure that those 5 individuals would allow themselves the opportunity to just be creative, be entrepreneur, you know, to really think about their families together, because it was the impact of those 5 women in a group would have an impact not only in their own families, but in the community. And most importantly, it was about sharing resources. And so one of those elements was sharing resources so that we could really look at the financial opportunities that a group of 5 women that has the entire community around them supporting would have, stability for their families. So that is something that we started to look at, and I still feel like there's a lot in that particular model that could work, and it worked for centuries. Now, I met with the governor of Okinawa to talk about this, to find out, like, where are you today? And he kind of smiled and said, I know Americans like this now, but we were we were doing really well until McDonald's came into Okinawa, until capitalism and fast food and all of this stuff started to come in. And so the idea of this, talk about paternalistic, this idea of being able to work in group and build each other up became now a competitive environment, which is what we live today. I'm gonna make it. I don't know if you're gonna make it. So that idea of community was completely removed. So there's history here globally that we can look at. I'm originally from Chile. When I grew up in Chile, we had socialized medicine, which we don't have anymore. We had opportunities. My father, in fact, because my family's entrepreneurs, entrepreneurship, like Marla said, it's about survival. It's about, I can do this. And my parents were very much about that. But before that, he worked for a company, actually the government. And so it was specifically around housing, because the idea was, if you own land, if you have equity, go back to that word, if we have equity, right? We live better, we support community, and their government then has less demand. So what they started to do, and they did this continuously. There was a period of time where if you wanted to buy your home, the government gives you half, would not anymore, would give you half of your down payment. And so community could help you come up with the initial, but government would give you at least half of that. So you had the down payment. So it allowed people to really begin to build opportunity and buy their little places, right? And so because home ownership, when I say, does home ownership mean everything? Maybe not to some people. But when you live in a community that doesn't have power or is considered to not have power, owning your land means everything, because politicians will not even talk to you because you don't produce taxes, right? You don't pay property taxes, so you mean nothing in this environment. So I think understanding the impact of land ownership in communities of color, particularly Black and Brown, it is critical. So I just want to make sure that we understand that piece of it. So I think that, for us, I also come from the finance background. And so I'm thinking, okay, we got to just blow this thing up. And I've been having conversations around equity funds, what happens with equity funds? How do we look at equity funds in a way that doesn't strip our communities, but we actually begin to take ownership of some of that? There are elements of equity funds that we should be considering. Hedge funds. Those are hedge funds are betting against us, right? And they're making a lot of money because, hey, we could bet against ourselves and we would be making money. So understanding that there are products in the private sector that can really apply to us if we collectively, with people like they're on the line right now, Anne, Marla, coming together, Tracy Gray, that are women that are just powerful, Holly Mitchell, who's involved in this, women that are putting everything they have on the line to look at systems that are already there. And we just need to switch in some way. So that's the collective power of coming together like this as women who are in this space.
Excellent. Thank you, Veronica. Thank you. So Dr. Parker, on the same note, just around that idea of the access to capital, I just want to say, one of the great examples of this, and Veronica just called out her name, Tracy Gray, co-founder of the 22 Fund, and myself and a few other folks went up to Sacramento and met with the Women's Caucus and others around Prop 209 and overturning it. And really excited to see Prop 16 on the ballot, which everybody needs to be, voting in favor of. Because what that does, and folks don't realize that Prop 209 was not just about affirmative action in the university or academic systems. It has also limited funds from designating women and people of color to receive capital. It has actually made it illegal. So we have had women of color and other people of color, entrepreneurs, going to places like Texas, where they can designate women and people of color to receive funds. Okay, folks? So it's easier for people of color and women to get seed capital in Texas than it is in California right now because of Proposition 209. So this is one of the reasons, and Coffee agrees, that you should be voting and looking at our Slate for Justice on our website, which will tell you that you need to vote for Prop 16. So, Dr. Parker, on the topic of access to capital, how do you deal with that when you're talking to your students and they do have great ideas and they do need capital? What are some of the recommendations you're giving them?
So I'm a firm believer that certain kinds of other capital can get you to certain kinds of other capital. What I mean by that is, we always think of capital just in terms of money, but if we're taking a cue, right, from our Caucasian brothers and sisters, we know that relationships and social capital leads to money as well, right? And so one of the things that I really encourage my students to do is to do a self-assessment about what are their strengths, right? Like, what are their strengths? And, there are students who are so good at talking. I mean, I've been taken in a little bit too much, right? And I'm their teacher, right? And so I think that students have to be really aware that they have these gifts and talents and other types of capital that can lead them to, right? That can lead them to what they want, to the big capital, right? Now, the other thing though too is starting where you are. Like you said, there are tools out there now and mechanisms and platforms that can really give you a jump start to your entrepreneurial venture, right? And so exploring and really exploiting those tools as much as possible just to get you started, right? I have a student who speaks Spanish and she's always wanted to be a translator, right? And I'm just like, there's demand for this, right? There are plenty of places that you can go to get this done, right? So I think for students, or I would say for those of us who are more experienced, it's really incumbent upon us to help students be a lot more savvy, as savvy as possible, to say, this is how you get your foot in the door. This is how you present yourself, right? A massive part of entrepreneurship is, and this, I kind of hesitate with this wording because of like the kind of racist constructs it has to it, but how you sell yourself, right? It's how you present yourself, right? Because people are definitely going to be attracted to you, and then also whatever product or service that you have, right? I remember two of my students pitched an idea. It was, I kid you not, it was a 5-minute presentation about an app idea that they had where it pretty much like translates technical policy language into something that's more accessible so that the everyday average citizen could understand what the heck, a bill is, right? Or whatever policy whatever is coming down the pipeline. And they told me afterwards that, as soon as they were done, this guy came running up after them. And this was like several years ago. This guy came running up after them and he's like, does this app really exist? Because I'm doing a weed startup and I need people, right, to support legislation that's going to support me. So if this thing exists, like, let's work together. Now, I wasn't there at the time because I would have told them how to navigate that whole situation, but they told me the story afterwards, right? So it's like, if you can situate yourselves in those kinds of context, right, then that matters, right? I'm working at a wellness tech company right now, and every single time I talk to the CEO and the founder who's out doing investments, every time, right, he comes back with like a fundraising report, people love the idea. They love it. And they are standing by, right? So if you know how to really work the existing capital that you have, right? Cultural capital, social capital, that can lead you into pathways to other types of capital, right? Now, on the other side, with people who have the money, you know, and this goes back to risk taking, and I love what Veronica said about, you know, this idea of community and communities coming together. Like, we really have to kind of overcome this kind of toxic individualism that I think that we've all been, you know, imbued with, right, and conditioned to live by. All the things that I talked about with what I was doing at KSIG, I had to shell out some of my own money to get it done, right? I could not wait for the university to give me the blessing. I couldn't wait to go through some kind of like application process. I couldn't wait to go through like the kind of bureaucratic machine. I'm like, I have to get this done. I believe in this. I'm going to use my own money, right? And so when I think about seed funding opportunities, I love the fact that we have organizations, but could we create like our own little micro seed funding communities in our own neighborhoods, right? Because again, let's say that you have someone who wants to do like a t-shirt business, right? You can use Shopify or another platform for maybe like $50 a month to get you started, right? And wouldn't it be cool, you know, if there were people who would be saying, okay, you know, I'll pay your Shopify bill for like the next 2 months, right? And then somebody else can pay it for the next 2 months, right? So it's like this kind of runway approach. And that's why I love like the whole runway concept, because it's super intimidating to try to go after $1 million, right? And you may not need the $1 million right then and there. You just may need like a fraction of that. And so is it possible for us to build these kind of micro runway, you know, like these kind of like the micro runway seed funding, right? To where it's like, look, I have no problem partying with like $200 to help you out to get you started. It's like the barriers to entry have to be a lot lower. And I think they have to be even micro localized.
Right. Great point. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Parker. I'm going to return back to Anne and ask her to respond to that idea of access to seed capital and bring us back into that conversation around UBI and reparations and you know, some of the structural barriers we have, because as we know, the way I'm seeing it is I'm going to get my, you know, universal basic income of $1,000, and then I'm gonna get in my car and I'm gonna get 2 parking tickets. My son's gonna get arrested and I'm gonna have to bail him out. You know, and there goes my money, right? So we do realize there are competing systems that, you know, when one door opens, they make sure that the rest of them are closed. You know, it's like it's the trick and the trap, right? It's like we're gonna help you, but not really. You know, so that's when I think about reparations, and I think about that as actually this much broader conversation. That's not just about money. You know, to me, when I think about reparations, that goes, you know, definitely in my mind, 100 steps beyond the idea of universal basic income, right? Reparations is where I'm thinking, okay, now maybe I really can get some seed funding and make my ends meet, and be able to, you know, get in my car and, you know, not get a ticket, and there's going to be more doors open somehow, right? I'm not writing the legislation. I know that there's been some legislation written around reparations, but with that, I'm going to come back to Anne.
That was great. Thank you so much, Michelle. I mean, I think, you know, one, you know, there have been some broader conversations around reparations, more than just the check. I think that people are thinking about this in various ways that often don't get lifted up. They are thinking about what this means about community. They are thinking about things and other ideas, like what about, like, you know, that this could be held as a land trust, and the whole host of mechanisms, right? And I think that we haven't heard enough from folks that have really kind of community-based ideas and thinking about how reparations can be shaped. Certainly, you know, the idea that people can actually have the wealth that they never received. I mean, we know that why we need reparations. Basically, if we, Black folks had gotten their 40 acres, there probably wouldn't be the wealth gap that we see today. It is the only group that was not provided with any seed capital, the only racial group in this country, right? And so, I think there's a lot of conversations that we can play out there. I have been involved a little bit in the UBI space, in the cash space, and I think the way that people are beginning to think about it is much different than how it started. And I got involved because I just didn't want to. I said this whole tech bro conversation about automation is not the conversation, right? This really does stem from a whole racial justice history of why the National Welfare Rights Organization thought about this, right? Why these were particularly women of color who understood our economy and understood what they needed to take care of their family. That's where these things came from the Panthers, right? Totally different trajectory. And so I do like the idea of cash for the very reason that people can make the choice themselves and how they want to utilize these funds. And we know from a couple of what we've seen so far, of course, in Stockton, is what are people using it for? Food. I mean, like really basic stuff, right? Food, utilities, debt, bills, But when I look at the Magnolia Mothers Trust, which is a pilot down in Jackson that's giving women $1,000 a month, but these are particularly low-income women make under $12,000 a year, a whole host of things we're starting to see, right? That people were able to saying, like, I could take my child to the ocean for the first time, right? That there are all these other kinds of opportunities that can open up. So when I think about this, I think, what about pooling? What about kind of a community way to pool funds to actually be able to seed something, right? And we can think about this in much bigger ways than what's being discussed right now, and it could be actually structured in a way that's different than how it's structured now, to actually have much more of a community focus. I think that's where the power is, and I think that kind of seeding could actually take people somewhere, particularly with the kind of the amounts of money we're talking about. And so I'm really learning from you, Dr. Parker. I think you've really raised some really great points about how to think about this in ways in which the conversations I'm in are like about these very large, it's about really like large amounts of capital, right? And it just gets stuck there. And it's also about the fact that everything here is about generating wealth, right? And what is going to build wealth. And I think even those discussions are very narrow. They're very narrow on the financial. They're not talking about all the aspects that I think people of color bring when they think about wealth. It's not just purely financial. It really is about social capital. It really is about mutual aid. It really is, we just think of these things very differently, and therefore the solutions and discussions, at least that I'm in, seem to be extremely narrowed and predicated on a model that's really built for white people solely, right? And then it's just supposed to be an overlay onto people of color, onto women, and it doesn't quite work. So of course, Veronica, I always learn and love what you're saying about community, and I just think that the solutions are here. I would love to see them in more spaces that I'm in, because I just feel like we're on a loop here that I feel like is not taking us to a place that gets at a broader discussion about wealth and what it means for people, because it's been far too narrow for far too long.
Can I add one more thing, Michelle, if you don't mind? I think another thing that's super important when we're talking about resources that we don't talk enough about, I think, but is critical to entrepreneurship is the resource of time. And so that can also be a barrier when you're trying to, like when you're a mother and like you want to get into entrepreneurship, and maybe you have, right, at your disposal the money, but you just don't have the time, right? Because like you're trying to work a job, you're trying to take care of your kids, you may have other caregiving responsibilities. And so you have the intelligence, you have the idea, you have the money, but you don't have the time. And so like, I think we really have to think about how can we even build our time banks here? How can we help each other build our time banks, right? Because the more I work, you know, like at this startup and even thinking about Kasich, right? I know that there are so many additional things that I could have done with Kasich if I had more time. Right. And then the other thing too is just like capacity, right? It's like we all know that as a small business, you have to wear many hats, but sometimes you can get a little bit dizzy. So like it's really important, right? I think to not just talk about resources in terms of, hey, here's a check for your seed, right? But can I get someone to do marketing for you? Can I get someone to do operations for you? Right? Because those are very important areas of expertise, right? That someone may not necessarily have, but it's absolutely critical. And so like if we have to think about this in terms of, in a certain way, efficiency, because like I know that can be like kind of like a dirty word, right? But if I am trying to overcome a learning curve to do like the best marketing, I'm taking away, right, from the other parts of my business that I need to build, right? So is there some kind of other support that I can get where I can have someone come in and take care of these very critical operational parts for me, so that I can do the best, so I can really shine in what I'm really good at with this particular business idea. So I can kind of keep the gears going, right? Like I'm not getting stuck. So I think that's like another thing to think about when we are talking about resources as well. So not just the money, right? But someone just to do stuff for me, right?
Mm-hmm. Can I add something? Do we have time, Michelle?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, as you're talking, Marlon, and, you know, one of the things that, that I know, Marla, we had a great conversation recently and just talking about success. So when we think about the space, it's so latent by the idea of success from this white paternalistic perspective. And if we don't make it there, then we're just not a success. So there's no option. We're a failure. So what does that mean in our communities when, you know, the findings of the motherhood study say, if women had the possibility of have those $400 a month to take care of their families, and their hope is higher education, entrepreneurship, home ownership, they're telling us this is where they are, right? They're telling us like, something as basic in that, I just want some opportunity. So let's think about success. And I think, you know, one of those other possibilities that we are now working on, we just really are expanding our entire resiliency aspect, economic resiliency aspect at CHC, and really growing that space. So one of the elements is, for example, on legacy businesses. So, you know, we need to look at those legacy businesses because, and we have a team member now that has been doing this for the last 15 years that we're now going to really go deep on. And so legacy, and has been successful at moving legacy businesses. He's on the line, Tomas Duran. And so how do we look at that, right? How do we look at legacy businesses that have been in communities of color? I mean, I can tell you that in South LA, I have talked to Black owners who have said, I am dying here. I need, you know, I can't do it anymore, but I don't want to sell it. I don't want to move out of this because I know you know, it's going to go away. It's not going to stay in my community. And so they're holding as much as they possibly can. And others have had to go. A lot of legacy businesses were closed out in South LA. Manufacturing licenses that were there that have been closed. And once you lose it, you lose it. So the innovation that can happen in our communities, given what we already have, is something that we need to look at, right, as an immediate. And when we were talking about building those community, I don't know if we want to call it funding, you know, entities, or how we support each other, and social capital building, and all these other spaces that we need to be in. That is one thing that we can look at immediately. you know? And then, so when I think about, and also the narrative around success and business transition, a few years back, quite a few years back now, after my father passed away, we were very, very close. This is very personal to me, but I couldn't be in this space anymore. I couldn't work in the nonprofit sector. I was like burnt out. I had no energy. So I decided to be creative and be an entrepreneur. So I started a jewelry design business, and it actually became very successful. And so we had a really good pipeline, but I could only do it for 5 years because that's not my space. I needed to be back in here. Social justice is who I am and what feeds me. So I wanted to sell the business. And there was a woman that I knew who I knew could do it, was very, interested. And I knew she didn't have the money to buy my business. But for me, it wasn't about making a ton of money on this business. It was about what I needed at the time. And I knew she needed that at the time. So my partner and I transferred the business to her with all of the sales channels that we had developed. And then with time, when she was doing it, she kicked back something to us. But it was about transitioning because I knew we were committed to building community. But that's one person. We need to change the narrative and encourage other women and other people of color who are successful in the space that we cannot make it alone, right? And there are ways of transitioning businesses, of looking at legacy, and really supporting our folks that have, actually consider made it in this space.
Thank you for that, Veronica. We're getting close to moving into our Millennial panel, which I'm very excited about. We're going to hear, I always say from, my future bosses, because these women are brilliant and they're young and they're powerful and they've got tons of more energy than I could ever imagine having at this point in my life. And so I want to make sure we give them adequate time. But in closing, I just want to go ahead and come back around to Anne and Dr. Parker and just see if you have any other sort of words of wisdom and advice that you can give us as we continue, I think, to come into our power. I really feel in the last, few years that as women and women of color, and I'm going to, give a big nod to Michelle Obama here, that we're just on fire. And in everywhere I look, in every place I see, it's just one accomplishment and after another. And I think what's even more important to me is the job that we're doing to support each other, right? In this very hyper-competitive, toxic environment that we have been in for such a long time, we haven't always done a good job of supporting each other. And I'm really, really excited about the fact that we're doing a much better job of that today. So in closing this panel out, and I'll go to you first, Anne, what else can we do to continue to support each other in closing these gaps and advancing social justice for ourselves?
Well, I think that really bringing some of these issues to broader audiences is really important. And I say that now because there's so much interest now. I mean, there's money being poured into different aspects of what people want to do around race and wealth. It's not necessarily extremely well thought out. And actually, over time, my concern is that people can say, well, we've made these investments, we haven't seen the impact, so this isn't something that we can really solve. I've certainly heard that before. And now that there's an opportunity and people are thinking about this, my biggest concern is, and even conversations I'm in, are what's being put out there right now, I think, is almost harmful because it is not really, lifting up lived experiences, ideas, innovation that's happening, and some that's been discussed here today. And I quite frankly, I'd love to see some of these conversations elevated more. I think we need different solutions, honestly. Like I said, I'm in conversations that just have been the same for nearly a decade, honestly. They haven't shifted dramatically, which is surprising. And so these kinds of studies, like the motherhood study, all these kinds of data, and even if this is qualitative and storytelling about experiences, is so important right now to shift our thinking about what's possible. And so anyway, I just want to say thank you to all the panelists and to the participants, because this is actually fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. Marla?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity, and I echo everything that Anne said. And on top of that, I would just say small is big, so start where you are. It can make a huge difference. If all of us are doing what we can in the areas that we lead in, because we're all leaders, that does add up, and we do it consistently, right? We do it consistently. That makes a big difference, and it can add up tremendously. So again, remember, small is big. So start where you are.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marla, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank
and
you.
Veronica, anything before we take a short break before our next panel?
Yeah, I would, I'm just like, wow, with all of you guys. So I would say, we've said before, this is a call to action. Like, we cannot let this moment pass, what we're talking about today. I'm going to keep saying it. We're doing it. So it's a call to action. We'll follow up. We'll have stuff. So we hope you come in. There's a lot of amazing women doing amazing work, and we're in this space together. We're saying, let's do it. So, and we can do that. And so the last thing with that, I would say then, let's keep the ecosystem as the word of the day. Because if we don't worry, and if we don't understand the ecosystem of our communities, then how do we build social capital? How do we understand what institutions are there for us or are not there for us? If we don't understand the ecosystem, how do we understand the dollars? As Anne said, completely right, I agree with her. What's happening today, it's a setup. And so how do we understand what that means to us? Because it's happened forever. This is not new. Like, we're not very good about history. I swear to God, I should have been a historian, but that wasn't my thing. But we should be looking at history. And we should understand that this has happened multiple times. It's a setup. Be careful. There's glass in front of you. And so I think understanding that means it's not about stepping over the glass. It's about wearing the right shoes and stepping over the glass. And I think that's what we're trying to do today. So I am super thrilled that we've had this 2 days of incredible discussions, and that will continue. But we'll continue with action. So thank you, everyone.